Hi, everyone. I'm Cheryl Landrew, Executive Director and Co-Chair of the New Orleans Book Festival at Tulane University. We're so happy you could join us tonight. This past spring, our Tulane Festival was canceled due to the pandemic, but since then, we've hosted several webinars on several topics ranging from the 1918 flu epidemic to race in America. And I know tonight's session is just going to be just as relevant to the times that we find ourselves in today. Before I introduce anyone, I'd like to say just to the people that find themselves in the path of Hurricane Sally, I just want to send our thoughts to you. You know, we've been in your shoes and we stand ready to help when this disaster is over. Also, I'd like to just take a moment to thank the patrons and the sponsors, some of whom are with us tonight, who make the New Orleans Book Festival at Tulane a possibility. So tonight's panel is history repeating, disasters in Louisiana, Katrina to Laura to COVID. Our panelists are Andy Horowitz, Tulane Professor of History and recent author of Katrina, A History, 1915 to 2015. Jarvis DeBerry is the founder and editor of Louisiana Illuminator, a nonprofit news organization. He's also a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and an author of I Feel to Believe, which will be released next week, and it's a collection of his columns while he was at the Thomas-Picayune. Sandy Rosenthal is the founder of levees.org. Sandy is a Tulane alum, and she's received the 2018 Social Entrepreneur Award, and she's also the author of Words Whispered on Water, Why the Levees Broke After Hurricane Katrina. And finally, Walter Isaacson, who is a renowned author, Tulane professor, and most importantly, a great partner at the Tulane Book Festival, New Orleans Book Festival. So Walter, I'm gonna leave it to you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks for all you've done. And thank Lindsay, Allison, everybody who's put this together. I want to start, before we actually get into the hurricane, I want to welcome Jarvis DeBerry back to our state. We missed him. He's got a whole lot of fans and friends down here. He went up to Cleveland. And I'm wondering, Jarvis, if I can just ask you, say welcome back, but also how's your health? Because we all followed your struggles there. And tell us about your new project.
Yeah, thanks so much, Walter, for asking me. To everybody out there, I'm doing great. Kidney transplant was 7 months ago next week, and have never felt better. So thank you for everyone who prayed for us and supported us. My wife, Kelly, and my daughter, Naomi, and me, we all really, really appreciate it. I helped launch a website called the Louisiana Illuminator on June 23rd. So we've just approaching our 3-month anniversary in recovering state government and state policy in Louisiana with a very small but dedicated staff. So LouisianaIlluminator.com, please visit the website and sign up for our newsletter. We'd love to have you.
Welcome back, and I guess
Thank
Kelly's got a book of poetry coming out too, right?
She does. It's already out from Xavier University Press, called Freedom Knows My Name. So
Cool.
yes, please read that. It would make us a very happy household if people buy both of our books.
Exactly. Well, we'll have her next March. I think March 17th or so is when we're going to have our in-person, I hope, Lord willing,
We hope.
Fest.
Yes.
And we'll have Kelly there too, even though I'm not sure I can do poetry moderation.
Understood.
And then let me start with Sandy Rosenthal, who led a crusade when a whole lot of people were saying, hey, they didn't maintain the levees and they had corrupt local levee boards. That was the problem with Katrina. And we, up until Sandy and her great efforts, people were talking about how the damage came from Hurricane Katrina. Nowadays, we say it's because the federal levees broke. So how did you get on that, Sandy? And I think you're still muted. So, and Andy, unmute yourself as well too. And Jarvis, since we've all,
yeah. Thank you. The impetus for beginning my organization, levees.org, came about 1 month after the levees broke. And I was talking to a gentleman from Alexandria who had heard the story, had heard that the reason New Orleans flooded was because of the people in New Orleans are all irresponsible and a burden to the nation, and they elect people who are corrupt. And that was the story that had gotten not only out of New Orleans, but nationwide. And I couldn't live with that. And so that's why I started the organization levees.org and did not let up until I felt that we gotten the word out that the flooding of New Orleans was due to federal engineering mistakes, the Army Corps of Engineers.
And Andy has that in the book, and Andy's book has gotten incredible reviews and done very well. You're in New Orleans now, right, Andy?
I'm out of town at the present, thankfully. I sort of accidentally pre-evacuated for this one.
I know. Last time you evacuated too. Sometime you'll be a good New Orleanian and just shelter in place.
I'll tell you, after writing a book about Katrina, one of my goals was to actually never see a hurricane in New Orleans. So far, so good.
Oh, okay. Well, being in the eye of the storm, it's a place you can dance. But tell us, one of the things that happened on the levees was a series of design decisions, right, Andy?
Yes, and Sandy may be the expert here on those design decisions. So I may send that back to her and then jump back in to give some context on what I think caused those decisions.
Yes, Sandy.
Well, I'm going to keep this, I'm not an engineer and very few people watching are, but to keep it short, the Army Corps of Engineers was behind schedule. The cost of steel was rising. The Government Accountability Office had taken the Army Corps to the woodshed and said, hurry up, because this is an important project. These levees need to be built. So the Army Corps did a study in the 1980s, but wrongly determined that steel sheet piling only needed to be driven down to 16 feet instead of between 46 and 60 feet. And when Hurricane Katrina's surge arrived, those levees broke. The newest ones, by the way, 17th Street, the London, and the Industrial Canal, all broke when water was about 4 feet from the top of the wall. Oh, and by the way, my book has been a #1 new release for 8 months. So my book is doing well too.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to, but I have to share Hebert Hall with Andy, or whatever the hall formerly known as Hebert Hall is. So, but so Andy, take us back to the context of making those decisions. And one of the really cool things about your book is you put it almost in a century-long context.
Yeah, one of the things that was striking to me when I started with what I thought was going to be a simple question, or a simple series of questions about Katrina. Who lived in harm's way, and why did they live there? And what I came to discover in the course of my research, the book starts with actually a quite big and largely forgotten hurricane that made landfall in 1915, just outside of New Orleans. And it remained probably the biggest storm to make landfall in Louisiana in the 20th century. And it arrived in New Orleans just as the city had finished building its then state-of-the-art drainage system, the same sewage and water board system the city relies on today, and was hopefully won't have to rely on too much, tonight and into tomorrow. And that system was meant to, well, since the colonial founding of New Orleans in 1718, the city had largely been constrained to the high ground by the Mississippi River. And that drainage system was meant to enable development into the much larger expanse of the city. And after this 1915 hurricane, engineers, city planners, New Orleanians in general believed that the city had passed a kind of defining test. The headline in the New Orleans item the next day was, "The record shows New Orleans is storm-proof." This despite the fact that, the parts of the city flooded and people even drowned in September 1915. But nonetheless, the experience kind of confirmed a consensus that New Orleans should grow. And those cities that were built, in the 20th century were long among, and remain often among, the city's most desirable neighborhoods. But then in 2005, when those failures that Sandy just described met a real challenge, if you were to trace the flood that ensued, what you're really tracing is the outline of the cities that stood right around 1915. Most of the buildings built before that storm did not flood in 2005. Most of the buildings built after did. Nearly all of them did. And so that for me was a way into understanding that, contrary, I think, to how many of us came to think of Katrina, it wasn't like, Black New Orleans versus white New Orleans, or poor New Orleans versus wealthy New Orleans that flooded. It was 20th century New Orleans that flooded. So this to me
In other
says
words,
that,
Lakeview and Lower Nine, both. But it was partly in in the way we did housing in the 1940s after the war and everything else. You described pretty vividly how they encouraged people to move into these drained areas. But on the other hand, there was a racial component to whether or not people could get the loans or the money, something we've all known, but it just reinforced the inequity of wealth building in the city.
this is one of the things that is so curious and honestly so complicated about the story of New Orleans 20th century and the construction of flood vulnerability in New Orleans. If I said to the audience to close your eyes and think about the American dream, the image that I imagine would come to mind for most of you is a single family house with a nice yard in a new neighborhood. And most of our federal policy, not just in New Orleans, but nationally for most of the 20th century, was designed to help some people at least realize that American dream. And that so for example, if you got the GI Bill in New Orleans, you couldn't use that to build a house in the Irish Channel or in parts of Uptown. Those were considered undesirable neighborhoods well into the 1980s and 90s. It was rather, you'd have to build in Gentilly or Lakeview or the Lower Ninth or Eastern New Orleans. And so there was a whole set of federal programs that encouraged people to move to these low-lying neighborhoods with the understanding that they were desirable and protected from floods. Now, what you're talking about with racial discrimination, of course, the history of the United States and the history of New Orleans is defined by racial discrimination. And paradoxically, in New Orleans, that various formulations of discrimination kept Black people confined to neighborhoods that were seen as least desirable, near toxic waste dumps, near industrial sites. Those were the older parts of the city on higher ground.
Yeah. What also struck me, and I'm going to turn it to Jarvis, is that when they were rating neighborhoods to figure out where they could give loans and where it was, safe to finance people moving in, if there were Black people there, that counted against you and you got a lower grade because they said the property values were not going to stand up. And that's from Andy's book. I was wondering, Jarvis, you've written about sort of the systemic problems we have with wealth building. How does that, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it all goes hand in hand. I was thinking and connecting what Andy was saying to some of the people that I talked to in the months after Katrina. One family in particular in the Lower Ninth Ward, their mother insisted on at all times having a white picket fence. So when you talk about the American dream and that vision that we have of the American dream, I don't think enough people outside New Orleans realize and appreciate it, that was indeed the American dream for many people in New Orleans. But I also talked to the patriarch of that family. They moved into that neighborhood right after Betsy. And, it had horribly flooded, but that's where they could afford. That's where they were essentially allowed to go. There were other communities closer to the lake, higher elevation that they would have preferred to go. Segregation made that impossible. So they built their little piece of the American dream smack dab on Tennessee Street, just a few hundred yards from the Industrial Canal flood wall. And so it was that pursuit of the American dream that left them the most vulnerable.
Sandy, you deal some in the book with the whole question of, where it was safe to live. How do you see this issue?
Again, as Andy does a beautiful job of doing in his book, this didn't happen in the past 15 years or 30 years, it's over 100 years. And the history is so rich and constantly moving and constantly shifting. And again, I love Andy's book, and I'm sure it will be read for many, many years to come. My feeling on that is I could see that this was happening. They look great together.
Yeah.
Um,
Can't wait for Jarvis's.
As I moved through the story, and my book is very different from Andy's. Andy's is a more of a buttoned up. He's a lot younger than I am, but it's more of a buttoned up text. And my book is a story, you know, told through my eyes and through my family's eyes and one other family, Harvey and Renee Miller. And I tried to show the wrongs that happened to us and that we were blamed for this flooding. And I definitely touched on, you know, Black neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, brown neighborhoods. And one of the things that in my book I concluded was that to give the Army Corps of Engineers, to blame them for giving inferior flood protection to the Lower Ninth Ward or to Broadmoor was, I hate to say, giving the Army Corps of Engineers credit for planning. There was no such plan as that. The Army Corps of Engineers made a massive engineering mistake and a wrong conclusion. And I believe, since it's my conclusion, I can say this, that it was a mistake and they did not know what was going to happen when Katrina's storm surge arrived on August 29, 2005.
We have, I noticed, and I've been told a few people in the audience, one of whom I want to call up and give a shout out to, if he's got his video ready to go on, is General Russell Honore, who I remember hanging with on Royal Street at the old Emeralds, and you know, when we first came back. Are you on, General?
Yes, sir. How you doing, Professor?
Hey, good to talk to you again. Can we see the Russell? Can we see General Honore?
I got sound. I don't see my little icon, but let me toss back at you that I'm so happy these books have been written. We've been dealing with the news of Katrina. Now we will start having the history of Katrina. I was told in a class at Southern University, which I had to take twice, Greek mythology. I couldn't get it the first time. My Pointy brain just couldn't accept it. So the second time I took it, there was an elderly professor and she asked us a question of relevance. She said, what do you think happened in Vietnam? Why did we get in Vietnam and why we're still there? I was about to leave Southern with the intentions to go to Fort Benning and go to Vietnam. So we all stumbled through that question. And what she said was, look, we won't know the truth about Vietnam till everybody who made the decision is dead.
Well, we hope, General Honore, that you write your own memoirs too, to be part of this. And so another person who's on is, and thank you for what you did, General.
Thank you.
I remember right afterwards, you were there giving orders, which is what we needed. Roberta Gratz, who's one of our authors, our 2020 authors. Roberta, do you want to ask your question, or I can read it because I see it popping up? Is Roberta on?
Can you hear me? I
hear you just fine.
Okay. Well, I think it's interesting. I certainly have read Sandy's book. I even gave her a blurb. Have not read Andy's book yet, but I think it's a very interesting connection to make to the times of development, the periods of development early in the city, which actually parallel nationwide, both redlining in all cities and the encouragement of suburban development. The real question, and I don't have an answer, but I think it's worth discussing, even at a time when not much is happening, is what direction should new development be? Because you know, I bridge two cities. I'm in New York, where we are making terrible mistakes. And unfortunately, they are being replicated in other places because New York does this. I mean, people follow New York, for better or worse. But I think it would be a useful conversation in New Orleans because there's a lot to be said for the kind of development that does not necessarily involve the development community as much as helping the individual homeowner community rebuild for themselves.
I'm going to take this, Roberta, and focus it a little on something that's we've all discussed, which was the question of rebuilding both in the lower Ninth Ward and outside of the levee system. I served under Norman Francis on the Louisiana Recovery Authority. Fortunately, I was not on the Road Home Committee. I was on another committee. But we had enormous debates about whether or not Lower Nine should be developed before the Industrial Canal levees got refixed. Andy, and certainly I remember Broadmoor, my dad calling me up one morning and saying, you just green dotted us. And I didn't know what he was talking about. But my neighborhood of Broadmoor got a green dotted in the first Bring New Orleans Back plan, which was the city commission. So should we have rebuilt Lower Nine right away, Andy?
I'm gonna not dodge the question, but answer it in a way that I think is demonstrable, because Katrina and the problem of New Orleans' future after 2005 is not in any way unique to New Orleans. It foregrounds a set of questions that the whole country faces increasingly. And it wasn't just the lower Ninth, 80% of the city had flooded. And so there was the lower Ninth and Lakeview and eastern New Orleans and Gentilly and this big expanse of the city that had flooded. And one way of reading that flood is to say the federal government failed in its basic responsibility to protect American citizens, and therefore they are owed, as citizens and as people, a right of return. And the other way of describing that situation is to say we now have a map of the parts of the city where it is murderously dangerous to live, where people can drown in their own houses, and even a very expensive, even the Army Corps of Engineers, for all, as Sandy knows, they weren't trying to drown people, they failed. And so, so the failures were going to resolve and drain into those neighborhoods. So how do you approach a question of the right of return to people's home places, generational home places, versus the need for safety in a climate crisis that is rapidly, being exaggerated? And to my mind, so should one neighborhood or another be rebuilt? To my mind, given how hard these questions are, I think the most important thing is simply a commitment to a kind of civic and democratic process, because we know that some of our schemes for the future will fail. So what we need to do is help people build the kind of social structures that let them feel good about the decision, even if it doesn't work out the way they want it to. So I'm sort of more interested in the democracy than the engineering or the city planning.
And Walter, if I can add to that, I think the problem with that question was always, there was never any discussion about, okay, if we don't rebuild the lower Ninth Ward and these were property owners, are we going to give them some property somewhere else where they can rebuild? That part never came up. It only seemed to be, oh, should we allow them to rebuild? Well, they own that land, they own that property. It is their right to be there. But if the government had said, hey, we're going to pay to move you to higher ground, we're going to pay to move you to a place that's less flood prone, I'm sure there would have been thousands of people who listened to that.
Well, actually, I'm going to push back on that a bit, Jarvis, because the Road Home program, and Andy can correct me because I wasn't on that committee, but I certainly sat in on all the meetings. The Road Home program did say, now the problem was it said pre-Katrina value, which may have been discriminatory to people.
Correct.
Homes were valued less. But it said if you stay in Louisiana and you move to higher ground, you get a bonus plus your pre-Katrina value. So we may have gotten the formula off, but there was an attempt to have people voluntarily move. And frankly, whether it was my family in Broadmoor or families in Holy Cross and Lower Nine, people didn't want to.
Yeah, and there was definitely some of that. Like I took the Road Home program, and I chose not to rebuild where I was, but the place where I bought was not that much less flood prone than the place that I had ended up. And there
Did
was
you get road home money?
I did. I
Okay.
did. And so I used that money to rebuild. But you also have to consider what the housing prices were doing, after Katrina. So if they gave me what my house was worth in Gentilly, would I really be able to buy uptown? Would I really be able to buy in the Lower Garden District? Would I really be able to buy in the French Quarter or Central City? No. So I'm still left with the landscape and the economic landscape and the problem of, okay, what can I afford with what they're telling me my house was worth?
And
Yeah, so
Walter, I
true.
need to add that, and you mentioned you didn't serve on the Road Home program. I think if you had been on it, you would have worded it differently. The way it was worded is that if you relocate out of New Orleans, we will penalize you. They use that wording instead of saying, if you stay here, we will give you a bonus. The wording was exactly the opposite. So, but that's because you didn't serve on the Road Home program.
Well, I just remember all the protest marches coming in, and I just speak personally. I was initially in favor of saying, let's give all sorts of bonuses to people to move out of the neighborhoods that flooded.
Wasn't worded that way.
Yeah, and then suddenly Broadmoor was one of those neighborhoods, and my parents, Cheryl's in-laws, and LaToya Cantrell, who was the head of head of the Broadmoor Improvement Association. She was not a politician yet. They all met in the front yard of our house on Napoleon and Galvez and got a band to play on the neutral ground, and it was Bring Broadmoor Back. And I said, oh, I get it. People don't like to be moved out of their neighborhoods, even for a bonus. So,
now I was, as the one person who wasn't here, but I recall that New Orleanians had a solution to this problem, which is that they wanted what were called Category 5 levies. So the solution that New Orleans wanted was make our city safe, invest the money it will take so that this doesn't happen again, so that I can stay in my home place. And this was, first of all, belief in engineering and the possibility of engineering to sort of hold off the threat of the climate crisis, but also a commitment to extraordinary federal action to protect an entire city, an entire region, the idea that the public good could work that way. And what replaced it, these sort of schemes, were individual decisions, still a lot of federal money, but it wasn't talking about neighborhoods or cities. It wasn't talking about a big public good. It was talking about, Jarvis, how much money will you get for your house, and where can you take your sort of your receipts and go bring them somewhere else? So we asked people. So what New Orleanians wanted was a civic solution on the scale of a city with action from the federal government. And what they got was, for homeowners and not really for renters, some cash to try to figure it out on their own. And it's just a very different vision of how these crises should be approached.
mhm.
And just to elaborate just a little bit on what Andy said, everything was 100% right. But you will not find a single expert, including myself, who will agree that the flood protection that got built after Hurricane Katrina and the levee breaches was the appropriate flood protection system for a city of this size, number of people, and infrastructure. It is not the flood protection that was authorized in 1965 after Hurricane Betsy. It's 100-year protection.
Well, for a quick follow-up on that, my brother, I noticed, speaking of Broadmoor, just popped up in the chat room and said, and I'll throw this one to Andy, I think, which is, so how safe, because Sandy just spoke on it, how safe are the levees now? And it's a two-part question for me. One is, there's two ways they could fail. One is that they could be overtopped, and the other is that they could just break and be breached, which is what happened to Katrina. And I assume the latter is worse than overtopping, but give me your assessment.
Well, with the caveat that I'm not an engineer, just to reiterate what Sandy has said here, the standard they're built to is the idea that the levees will have a 1% chance of being overtopped every year, which means they're pretty likely to be overtopped. We should all expect to see that. Now, they are built to be more robust, so hopefully, as you just said, they won't fall down, and we'll have, a foot of water in the city or some feet of water in the city, as frankly we're used to on very rainy days, as opposed to the sort of, lethal catastrophe. But this standard, this 100-year standard, is not just inadequate and insulting. it's premised, we should remember this, on congressional statute of a cost-benefit analysis that says that any kind of federal action shouldn't be judged on what it protects and its meaning to the people who live there or to the country, but rather on how much benefit it produces. So for example, in the recent study that the Army Corps did, building levees that are built to a twice as strong standard, a 200-year standard, still not adequate, still had a positive economic benefit, but it didn't result in quite enough economic gain for the Corps to be able to do it. So we have this, I mean, nobody would think, I don't think anyone listening to this conversation would think, should we save New Orleans? Let me reach for my calculator to try to answer that question. But in fact, that is precisely what Congress orders the Army Corps to do, to try to figure out a very alienated sense of economic value for human safety and the security of one of the world's great cities.
I'm going to do what I do in class, and I assume you do this too, as Andy, which is the cold call on somebody who I know or I think is in the audience and is a young, recent student who interned at the Aspen Institute, but is now an engineer and decided to move to New Orleans and work for the Corps of Engineers. And his name is Isaac Mudge. I don't know if Isaac, if you're on, unmute yourself and say something. And thank you for moving to New Orleans to work for the Corps. We actually like the Corps despite, you know, what happened when the levees broke.
Yeah, sure. I'm on. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm listening with wide open ears and am enjoying the panel so far. I don't have any firsthand experience with any of this quite yet, but I'm excited to get that, and you know, a lot of lessons to take from here. So thanks for
Well, buy all the books,
everything.
whatever you do.
Yeah, buy all the books, exactly.
Yeah. Cheryl Duvall, comment on the ways that it altered the demographics of the city. Let me start with you on that, Jarvis.
Yeah, it changed, to borrow Nagin's phrase, it changed New Orleans from a very chocolate city to a still chocolate city, just not quite so much. So I think we went from about 70% Black to about 60% Black now. But the demographics have changed greatly. And a lot of that is due to the neighborhoods themselves, individual neighborhoods. Some of those higher ground neighborhoods that Andy has already mentioned. I think we're seeing particularly a lot of change in Treme. In particular, I talked to Jerome Smith, who is the kind of civil rights godfather for the Treme neighborhood. And he's been there all his life and talked about all of the different musicians who've grown up in Treme. And he told me very bluntly a couple of years ago, there would be no more trombone shorties coming out of this neighborhood. Because it has changed so much. You don't have children playing on the streets, picking up instruments and following their uncles and grandfathers down the street playing music anymore. So we've seen property values increase to such an extent that people can't afford those neighborhoods that were inhabited by their uncles and aunts and grandparents. So New Orleans is still a Black city, but I think that in the kind of core historical neighborhoods, you don't see what you used to see before Katrina. You don't see that kind of musical spirit, that kind of neighborhood cohesion that you used to see.
You know, when the 10th anniversary, because I was on the Recovery Authority, I flew down with President Obama, and they asked me to talk to the press on the way down on the airplane. And out of the first 4 questions, 3 of them were about gentrification. And it was, you know, gentrification of Treme, and then all the people coming into Marigny Bywater and the St. Roch. And I finally said, you know, gentrification is a very complex issue. But if you had asked me 10 years ago, when I saw the waters and we were crying as we came back in, that 3 out of the first 4 questions would be about gentrification, And Sean Donovan and then the president spoke up talking about, what should you try to do? And, I think it's a problem, but that on that 10th anniversary, it felt like a high class problem to have. I noticed, Jarvis, did you want to add to that or no? I noticed as people pop up and I'm calling on them, somebody who was quite involved in all this, Mitch Landrew, I see you're around. Do you want to thank you for all your support here, on, especially for Book Fest, but you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And first of all, thank you guys for all of your work. It reminds me that the story that Russell Honore told, who, by the way, is just a great friend of mine and was a savior for us. And I love him in general. If you listen, and I miss you. The lens of history through perspective. Very, very early in the fog, there were a lot of stories that were written that don't have the perspective of time. And I think looking back on it is critically important. And you were reminding me while you all were talking, because I was, as you know, had my feet on the ground down here, that when immediately after it happened, I don't know if this was President Bush's first visit. It's when he came in and drove around and he said, the city looked like it was coming back. I think it was, Walter, the day that we had lunch at Dookie Chase's, if I'm not mistaken, when Junior Rodriguez hit him in the butt with his cane.
Yeah,
you remember that?
That's a memorable lunch, yeah.
From time to time, the president asks, governors or mayors or lieutenant governors to get in the car with him. And I got invited to get in the car with him on the leg of one of the points from one point to the next in the city. And you may remember the time, this is before the federal government had decided what the mechanism was that they were going to use to get federal funds down to New Orleans. And there are lots of different pipelines. But at the time, if I recall right, Congressman Richard Baker was proposing something called the Baker Plan that was designed after the Tennessee Valley Authority and another of different entities that was separate and distinct from the normal operations of government, that can incur debt, that could spend money and get money down to the ground quickly. That was one big issue. And as you recall, Al Hubbard was President Bush's economic development guy, who was the point. And Al Hubbard and other people basically thought, Jarvis, to your point, that this was not really, it was a federal issue, but what governs locally governs best. And their attitude was generally, we're going to help, but we're going to make them stand up on their own to the extent that they can, and we're going to make sure that they only get what they're entitled to. And at the time, there were discussions about what they were going to build the levees back to, and there was overt discussions that happened in that car about Category 3, Category 5. All of us down here said, you got to build back to Category 5 levels, because I want to remind you about Betsy. I want to tell you about Camille. I want to tell you that, I don't know what you call a 100-year storm or a 2, but we keep getting hit and these storms are getting bigger, and we've got to go to 10,000-year protection, or at a minimum 500-year protection. And there were people who were arguing about how much it costs to do 3 and how much it costs to do 5. And what the decision was made at whatever level, outside of way above my pay grade, was that the federal government was only going to reimburse like the Category 3 strength. And so, when people asked us, well, is the city better off than it was? The answer is yes, but it's not nearly where it needs to be in the future, Sandy, given the work that everybody else has done. And now with climate change, basically magnifying subsidence, sea level rise, and of course, the damming of the Mississippi, which stops the regular flow of nutrients into the marsh. And so, the answer is yes, it's better than it was before. And yes, we are significantly more protected and the levees are stronger because, Sandy, you're exactly right. Katrina was a result of an engineering failure. Bad design, bad implementation, bad planning, bad execution. That is why the city of New Orleans got wet after Katrina. And it would not have happened, quote unquote, had the levees not broke. So I just remember that yesterday. And then Walter, I also remember my mother calling me. My mother and father live on Priya Street in General Pershing at the lowest part of Broadmoor. And when that commission put out the green dots, the phone, it was like, you got to be kidding me. And so, to answer the harder question that we all have to think about when you say, should people have gone back to lower 9? Those decisions are a lot easier to make when you don't have human beings to consider.
Right.
Because a lot of people, as you know, Jarvis, a lot of people had chances, but people said, I'm not leaving. A, because I don't want to, and B, I don't have anywhere else to go. And this is the best I'm going to get. And so when policymakers are making those decisions and they don't consider human beings and history and culture, they miss how complicated and how difficult those decisions are to make. And I just think it is an issue that people all across America have to think about, because as all of you know, there are other cities that are much more vulnerable than New Orleans. I think we're number 10 on the list, and Miami being number 1 and New York being up there and a lot of other places. So these are tough issues that have to be thought through, and as we're trying to do right now.
Jarvis, you wrote a column for the Illuminator, I think not too long ago, about did we learn the lessons of Katrina? Talk about that, and I'm going to have Sandy and then Andy also answer whether we learned the lessons of Katrina.
Yeah, it's something I started thinking about during the midst of this pandemic, actually. America claimed 15 years ago that it had learned, oh my God, we can't allow people to be this poor, that they are trapped in a place that, in an environment that's going to kill them. America claimed to have been shaken awake by the startling realization there was racism all around. And yet, when Governor Edwards said in April of this year that 70% of the people in Louisiana who had then died of COVID-19 were Black, it was little different to me, at least, than what we were seeing on our television screens after Hurricane Katrina. And so it seems to me that we are just as comfortable at allowing people to get mired down and trapped in poverty the way that we always have been. And it also seemed to me that we were not so moved to action, especially here in Louisiana, when it seemed that COVID-19 was just a Black thing. We had lawmakers saying, oh, why are you shutting down the economy? You don't need to do this. We have to rescue our buildings. And people were dying by the dozens daily. And yet it didn't seem to matter when it appeared to everyone that the only people suffering were Black. And obviously, as Andy knows, as Sandy knows, as I know, it was not at all the case that Hurricane Katrina fatalities were exclusively Black. That's not at all the case. But there arose this idea, I believe, that, oh, this is a Black thing, this is a Black problem. Therefore, it made it easier to blame the victims, and therefore it made it easier to avoid actually doing something that was meaningful and substantive and helpful.
Sandy?
Yes, I am at the moment filled with a rage and a deja vu over what I heard in the Woodward tapes, that our president knew how dangerous coronavirus was and did and said nothing and misled the public. In those first 8 weeks, my four close friends of my good friend, she knows who she is, they're dead now. And I'm shaking with anger that this information was withheld from us. The American people were misled. But this has happened before. 15 years ago, the reasons for the levee failures was withheld from the American people by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers through the Defense Department. The reason that the levees broke was kept away from us for all kinds of reasons that I go into in my book. But the idea that everyone got into their head that the people of New Orleans are irresponsible and they don't deserve help, it's a crime. And so there's a huge deja vu for me, watching what happened. This happened, these tapes were made in January, I understand, and 9 months later, we're hearing about this. Similarly, with the flooding of 15 years ago, it took, not similarly, it took many, many years for the truth to come out. Fortunately, we can remember this is the United States of America. And hopefully what we learn is two things. One is the power of asking questions and not stopping until you get a good answer. And the power of people is alive and well. And also that we can have faith in our American system of the United States of America, and that misleading our people like this is not going to be kept from us. We will find out, hopefully sooner, better than later. I think 9 months later is not soon enough.
Right. Andy?
It's hard to know how to enter this moment, except I've just been sitting with what Jarvis said about whose death counts, whose suffering matters, and the comments about gentrification. And I'm just reminded that the way we think about Katrina or any disaster is we treat it as kind of an exception. And our goal becomes to put things back to normal, to the way they were before. And that can so insidiously sort of excuse a lot of suffering. So just to say what I mean more specifically, if you lost your home because it flooded when the levees failed, at some point, despite all the problems, at some point, you were at least entitled to some disaster relief. Came too late, but because the goal was to put you back in a house. But if you lost your house because your mortgage went underwater, that's seen as normal. So by making a kind of exception out of a disaster, we normalize other suffering. And we see that kind of again and again. So gentrification is sort of an okay, sort of acceptable way to lose your house and to be displaced. But the threat of the flood is too much to bear, and we have to fight it. And I think that, you know, the one lesson of Katrina, there are so many lessons of Katrina, but one I think is to reflect on what suffering and what death we're willing to accept. Are we, you know, who can die of the coronavirus? Who are we going to allow, like me, to work from home? And who are we going to force to go put themselves at risk in person? And I think in a somewhat scattered way where I want to kind of land here is I think all the time about the great New Orleans author Kalamu Ya Salam, who wrote in early 2006, he said, every day we're faced with this question of what is this New Orleans we want to save? And to me, what that meant was, do we want the, you know, Treme to exist as a place on the map? Are we interested in the architecture? Or are we interested in the kind of cultural continuities that Jarvis is talking about? Do we want to sort of support the families who have created these world historical goods? Or do we simply want it to be a lovely place for people to live regardless of their musical achievements? I mean, in all of these ways, I think, you know, thinking too hard about the flood itself and the water can distract us from the broader social questions that Katrina sort of animates, and can blind us from the fact that, as Jarvis said, though the flood impacts were widely shared, the impacts of the recovery were not. And so the reason that 92,000 Black people could not return to New Orleans, but only 8,000 white people couldn't, the reason for that discrepancy is not the flood, it's our social policy. So I think if I could just land here, the lesson of Katrina is to try to look away from that acute emergency and perceive the broader social surround and the values that create the inequalities that we tolerate too easily, too many of us.
And if I could also add, Walter, you know, and alluding to something that Sandy has said about this presumed irresponsibility of New Orleans and New Orleanians, that was certainly a narrative that spread across the United States after Katrina. Oh, why were they there? Why were they there to get trapped by a storm? Well, I helped take a woman home Sunday morning before Hurricane Katrina because she showed up to her job at a hotel downtown New Orleans, thinking that she was going to have to work that day, not daring to not show up to work and be fired. Now, who are the people who are most likely to get infected or have been most likely to get infected during COVID-19? Those frontline workers, the ones who worked at hotels, the ones who worked in restaurants. So it's not irresponsibility that has led them to get hurt. It's the exact opposite. They were being responsible. They were trying to keep food on the table. They were trying to do their part to earn money to take care of their families. And it is in the act of being responsible, not ditching work, not saying, oh, to hell with that job, but saying, I have to report, I have bills to pay, I have rent that's due, I don't have sick leave, I can't just take off, I can't leave my boss in the lurch. And that is what put them closer to disaster, whereas some of us, as Andy just mentioned, can work from home. Some of us have the luxury to say, oh, well, I'll just work remotely if there's a storm coming. Well, not everybody has that luxury.
Yeah, it's exacerbated the divide that we've always had. when you say people can work from home and their knowledge workers are going to be privileged. Michael Tizarand, who is one of our favorite local authors, he submitted a question, but I'm going to let him ask it himself if he can figure out how to unmute.
I just unmuted myself. Was I successful?
Very successful.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see your faces. It's great to see any faces. So I've got a simple little question. And that's, so given the increase of climate change related disasters we are seeing every day, the wildfires on the Western coast now, the continuing suffering in Puerto Rico, and add on and add on and add on. I find myself wondering what kind of response and reaction we would get from the country if a similar scale disaster happened in New Orleans now. Both the federal response and even the compassionate response. I know we all experienced, who were in New Orleans in 2005, these amazing moments of compassion. What do we think would happen now? And then I want to kind of tack on another thing that I'd love to hear any of you all speak about, is to increase compassion and also to try to prevent the need for that kind of compassion. What specific kind of citizen actions do you think we should be trying to focus on right now? Like what Sandy's book's an example of an amazing citizen action that that has such a big impact. But what would you recommend people do besides, of course, vote in November to try to get us to a slightly better place there? And thanks again for this.
Every person to pick one of Michael's two questions.
Okay. May I go first?
Yeah.
And I'd love to answer the first question first, and that is, how would people feel or react if they heard that one of these disasters happened to New Orleans? I really believe, and I don't blame them for saying, oh, not again. I would not blame them. And in my book, and I repeat it now, I understand why the American people believe that New Orleanians brought their disaster upon themselves. I understand why. It couldn't possibly be the Army Corps of Engineers with its 200 years of experience. That doesn't make sense. It makes sense to believe it was local corruption or city below sea level. So because of that initial belief that people already had, that was reinforced by the Army Corps disinformation campaign that lasted years, yes, I would not be surprised if the American people thought to themselves, oh, not again. So with that, who would like to take it next?
Yeah, I agree with that part. Just as recently as last year, I think it was, Peter King in Iowa was using New Orleans as his foil to compare to Iowa. I mean, fortunately and surprisingly, he got bounced. So that's a good thing that's happened. But people continue to use New Orleans as a textbook case of irresponsibility. And so I don't expect there to be a whole lot of compassion brewing. And at the same time, to Michael's question, I think people are just maxed out of everything, maxed out of compassion, maxed out of money, maxed out of patience, maxed out of everything. I mean, everyone right now is going through their own personal disaster where they are trying to figure out how to navigate their own jobs and their children's their children's need to be on virtual learning. Okay, I'm talking about myself in that regard as well. But so many of us are doing that. How do we keep ourselves from getting sick? How do we, navigate all these other things? And at the same time, fires are burning. At the same time, there's storms, 5 of them right now in the Atlantic. So I think people talked about Katrina fatigue way earlier than I thought that phrase was justified. But I think that we do have a real fatigue now of just kind of disasters generally. I think people are just maxed out.
Well, it's totally biblical given the coronavirus, the fires in the West, 7 storms all at one time, running out of names. So we're going to have to start using Greek letters.
Yes.
And so it's, I do think there's a compassion fatigue that will hit in. Andy?
The good news is I have the solution for all things, which is seriously to recognize that of course we're all overwhelmed because there's simply, you know, one damn thing after another. But if we zoom back and take a historical view, we can see that how closely they are related. The fires in California, the floods that we face, the storms that are in the Atlantic are all consequences of the climate crisis. And so too, if we ask what caused the pandemic, you know, we shouldn't look narrowly at some virus that jumped from a bat to a person in Wuhan, China. We should say, this is the failure of the federal government to do something as simple as provide N95 masks, which should have been, you know, this one of the single easiest things for a country as wealthy and powerful and technologically advanced as the United States. So what we have here is the realization of a very decades-long project of conservatives in the United States to do what the anti-tax activist Grover Norquist said, which is to shrink the federal government down to a size where he can drown it in the bathtub. And this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like when we've completely decapitated the power of Americans to work together through the mechanism of their federal government. These are all problems with solutions. New Orleans, there is engineering that can really make our city much safer. There are redistribution programs that could really eradicate poverty, or at least really take the misery out of the bottom of it. We can do better forest management. We can stop the virus very easily. We can make it not an economic problem to have to stay home for the 3 weeks that it would take to quash the virus. These are things that we've created a federal government that it simply declines to do these things. And so we should remember that there's really, you know, a root problem that can be addressed that would solve everything else. And in this terribly hopeless season, I think that is the reason for hope, that there really is something that might be done. And it's going to take a serious amount of organizing and political change.
There are a few questions, including Cara Wood, talking about some of the things that happened after the storm, such as education and the decentralization of schools. I won't call it charters because it's all public schools that were decentralized. Let me go reverse order. I'll start with Sandy again. Tell me your take. I know you're actually related to Leslie Jacobs, who was one of the leaders of that reform. Your take on the reform of the school system after Katrina.
Well, I am a data person. My book had 500 footnotes. It was 1,000. My first draft was 1,000. So I'm going to look at the data, and I'm going to point out that no matter what measure you choose, pick any measure, you know, graduation rates, testing, pick a measure of schools, they're better than they were, way better than they were before Hurricane Katrina arrived.
It's like being the highest mountain in New Orleans, though, which is they weren't that good to begin with. But I agree. But I try to listen because there's a lot of pushback at times about what those reforms meant to some people. So Jarvis and Andy.
Yeah, I'll go. I have asked this question before, so it won't be surprised. I always find that the biggest cheerleaders of the new system are people who don't have their children in them. And so I like to personally ask people who do have children in them, and how are they responding to that? And there are very, very few people who can actually compare what the schools were like in 2005 to what they're like now. Not many parents had children in the system pre-2005 who have them post-2005. But I don't see these schools as having been the great equalizer that we thought they were going to be. They're still largely places that have been largely abandoned by people who have any kind of means to do otherwise. We are still seeing that, you know, anybody with any kind of means are usually either going to the exclusive schools or they're going to the private schools. So to me, the measure of the quality of the schools is, do people with means send their children to them? And right now in New Orleans, that answer is no. So if that answer is no, that suggests to me that they don't think that they're quality enough for their children. So they shouldn't be seen as high enough quality for the children.
Real quickly, before I get to Andy on that, let me ask Andy, do you have data on that? Are more people sending, whoops, there goes Sandy. All right. Oh, I mean, I'm not pushing back, Jarvis. I've been involved with New Schools New Orleans, and it's data we're trying to figure out is to what extent are more people trying to go into the public schools. I know that a couple of private schools say they're having trouble now because at least with the more magnet schools, it competes well enough and people are moving out, but I don't know the full data. Sandy, did you want to give it or do you have any? No. All right, Andy, do you have thoughts there?
What you said, Andy.
Oh.
So Sandy and Andy are very much alike. Again, Leslie Jacobs is my sister-in-law, but she didn't ask me about the levies and I didn't ask her about the schools.
Okay.
So, but I think it's a great one.
Andy?
Renee? Without, I mean, we could and should have a conversation just dedicated to the school system in New Orleans, but without sort of wading into are the schools better and that question, my sort of historian and contextual approach is maybe just to simply observe that to say that schools are going to be the great equalizer, that the best schools could possibly lift kids out of poverty, is to say that kids in New Orleans are just not smart enough, and that if we could just make them smarter with better schools, that they would be able to overcome all of the structural things that are stacked against them. And the truth is, there's very little data that says that doing very well in school will help you get out of poverty, will change the conditions, the structural conditions. And the data that stays with me from 2015, when those first good studies really came out that said the schools are producing higher achievement on standardized tests, which is something that surely we want to celebrate. Surely we want to celebrate students doing better on the tests in school. At the same time, studies showed that nearly half of kids in New Orleans knew someone who had been murdered. A third of kids in New Orleans said they worried about not being loved. I mean, these are just horrific problems that schools aren't designed to solve and can't solve. And I think we should take a step back and ask about the kind of world that we've created for the kids in our city, and know that whatever our feelings are about the kind of instruction the kids are offered or the kind of union that their parents are offered as educators, that we have to think more broadly about the sort of world that we're creating for them.
And real quick, to wrap it up on a more optimistic, on an optimistic note too, is surprisingly people came back and then new people came. The people who came as volunteers ended up staying. Jarvis, you came back from Cleveland and Andy moved down from up north. What is it about New Orleans that gives it a certain resilience and a bounce back ability? And I'll start with Andy, then Sandy, and then Jarvis, just going in the order that people keep rearranging themselves on my Zoom screen. Make this your wrap-ups.
Yeah, what draws people to New Orleans? I don't know, probably the comparatively affordable house in the Treme that Jarvis was just talking about, displacing people who lived there for a while. It depends, the sort of resilience and heroic sort of celebration of New Orleans, which I am completely all in on. I believe that New Orleans is one of the great achievements in American history. The gifts that it has given the world in its sort of sense of celebration, in Mardi Gras and jazz, and the creativity that sort of stands as a rebuke to much of what the United States often kind of seems to stand for, draws people to the city and they love it. But often the tools that we use to support them displace and often immiserate the very people who they mean to celebrate. So you come because you love New Orleans, you moved to the Treme, and you displace the person you claimed you moved here because you loved. And I think all Americans need to think hard about how we design systems that sort of reapportion the profits and liabilities of American life on to, sort of hoard up the profits for a few, and some people get to enjoy the best of New Orleans while the great mass of people often do not. That's not the hopeful answer you wanted, but it is my view of things.
Sandy?
Well, by the way, I'm a transplant as well. I grew up in New England, in the Boston area. I can park the car in the yard by the river. So I join my colleagues in not being born and raised here. And I would like, I do have a very positive note though. So I came here from another place, and we were talking about the comparisons of disasters in Louisiana. I saw two very, very similar things after the levees broke and when the coronavirus arrived. And that is, we New Orleanians all said, we can do this. We will get through this. And 15 years ago, we came back, we rebuilt, the neighborhood pride strengthened. I mean, what neighborhood you're in now became like a big focal point. People who, you know, maybe before the levees broke, barely knew who I was, you know, take the time to say hello now. And then fast forward to 15 years, 15 years later, when the coronavirus arrived, what did New Orleanians do? They stayed home, they put on their masks, they did what they needed to do. And New Orleans, even though we started out as a hot spot, managed to get its positivity, that is percent of tests that are positive, way, way down to the point where it actually was safe to go out carefully, but we could come out of our homes, and we continue to do that. And I do believe it's that New Orleans, we can do this, and we can do this together, is the reason that New Orleans is such a wonderful place.
Jarvis, last words. You're still muted though. Yeah.
Am I good now? I got kicked off for a second. My Wi-Fi glitched on me for a second, so it muted me back in. One of the first columns I wrote after Katrina mentioned being in a Treme at a workshop led by Kalamo Yasalam, who Andy mentioned earlier. And there was a second line parade that went by. And it turns out that that second line parade was held for a homeless man whose body had just been found behind Charbonnet Funeral Home. And I could not conceive of another place on earth where a homeless man would have warranted a parade, that there would be such a sense of community and such a sense of everybody being important, that this character, who might be otherwise overlooked in every other place that he could be in, was in fact given a send-off in New Orleans. And it was one of those moments that made me realize there is no place like this anywhere else. And if I want to be in a place that is of its own and not a duplicate and not something that's like a cookie cutter city in the country, that New Orleans is that place. And that spirit endures. It's struggling, it's fighting to endure, but I don't expect it is going to die.
Well, thank you, and welcome back home, Jarvis. And
thank you, Walter.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Andy. And thank everybody for being part of this. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Allison Hushberg, and Lindsay Billups, and everybody else who put this together. And all of you have been patrons, supporters of the Book Fest. We're going to keep this hope alive that we'll have a real second line, some real parades and some real music in March. So see you all, and thank you very much.
Thank you.